Hello and welcome to another episode of Our Story, 250 Years of the United States of America. Today we will be covering the final battles from the War of 1812, and looking into Andrew Jackson, who is a figure that will continue to come up through our story with increasing regularity. It's a bit of a slower year, but there's still tons to get into, so let's start the episode. Welcome to 1815 in America. It's New Year's Day in the United States of America, and a significant artillery duel occurs at the Battle of New Orleans, where the British main army arrives. McCarty House is fired at while Jackson and his officers are eating breakfast, and the house is completely destroyed while Jackson and his officers luckily escape. During the 3-hour exchange, American artillery fire damages or puts out of commission most of the British guns despite them having more cannons, with Andrew Jackson successfully repulsing Edward Packingham's British forces. Packingham decides to wait for his entire force of 8,000 men to assemble before continuing his attack. On the morning of January 8th, the British attack gets underway before sunrise. On the British left, Major General John Keene's infantry penetrates an unfinished redoubt, only to be brought to a grinding halt in front of the New Orleans Rifles and the 7th U.S. Infantry. Major General Samuel Gibbs' column advances against the American left center, where his ranks are decimated by Tennessee and Kentucky militia. Gibbs is mortally wounded. Attempting to rally his men, Packingham rides forward with his staff, but is hit by an American volley. He is carried from the field, but dies later from his wounds. Now, I had to vet this pretty carefully because I often hear this number and it's just hard to fathom, but indeed, of the 3,000 men under Gibbs and Keene, 2,000 become casualties in less than 30 minutes. A soldier from Kentucky later writes, "When the smoke had cleared and we could obtain a fair view of the field, it looked at first glance like a sea of blood. It was not blood itself, but the red coats in which the British soldiers were dressed. The field was entirely covered in prostrate bodies." The smashing success is due in a large part to the brutal tactics of Andrew Jackson and his careful planning. Jackson organized the city's defenses, including erecting gun batteries, deploying gunboats, and felling trees to clog water routes to impede the British from landing. He also made several controversial decisions, such as declaring martial law in the city, welcoming the aid of Jean Lafitte and his pirates, and even forming a regiment of armed free blacks that he treated as equals. His men constructed ramparts more than 5 feet high and as many as 20 feet deep and reinforced them with logs. The artillery was dug in at regular intervals, and all these earthworks just created a bloody field of fire. The remnants of the British force withdraws beyond the range of the American guns, and Packingham's successor, Major General John Lambert, is unable to salvage the British effort and recalls the British forces. For Americans, there's an upsurge in patriotism with a stunning victory after years of difficult fighting and the humiliation of seeing their capital burned. In this absolute rout, only 13 are killed, and some 39 are wounded. Americans largely hail Jackson as a hero, and for the next half-century, January 8th will be marked by celebrations across the United States. Some 120 years on from now, this event inspires the famous Jimmy Driftwood song that I remember hearing a lot growing up.
In 1814, we took a little trip along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty mountain. Took a little bacon and we took a little beans. We met the bloody British near the town of New Orleans. We fired our guns down the British cavalcade. There wasn't nice many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they
I kind of brushed past the controversial actions that Jackson takes, and there's a lot to this, and it's debated what ends are justifying of what means all the time. But in order to get a complete and clear story, this next portion is adapted from an article published on the official website that represents the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Louisiana. On December 16th of 1814, Major General Andrew Jackson, commanding the 7th Military District, declared the city and environs of New Orleans under strict martial law. Shortly before Jackson's arrival in the city to defend it against the British, Governor William C. Claiborne of Louisiana had advised the general that the local troops had actually resisted his orders, being encouraged in this disobedience by the legislature of the state then in session. Jackson asked the legislature to suspend the writ of habeas corpus to render it possible to impress seamen. But the legislature refused, and instead offered a bounty of $24 per month to sailors who could engage voluntarily in the public service. On December 28th, Jackson was told that the legislature was contemplating surrender of the city to the enemy. The general immediately wrote a hasty note to Governor Claiborne, directing him to watch the movements of the legislature closely and to place a guard at the door of its hall the moment any sign of surrender appeared. The governor, only too willing to hold the legislature in check, placed a guard at the door of its chamber before the houses met, and thus, instead of locking them in, he shut the members out. On January 8th, in a brief but decisive engagement, the British were ignominiously defeated in the Battle of New Orleans, with just over 2,000 casualties against less than 100 for Jackson's forces, and the British withdrew and abandoned their expedition. Actually, 15 days prior to this last engagement of the War of 1812, the Treaty of Peace bringing the war to a close had been signed at Ghent on Christmas Eve of 1814. Now the middle of February, unofficial reports of the peace begin reaching New Orleans. This intelligence has so demoralizing an effect on Jackson's forces and creates so intense a feeling among the populace that on February 20th, Jackson finds it necessary to issue a warning proclamation saying, "We must not be thrown into false security by hopes that may be delusive. To put you off your guard and attack you by surprise is the natural expedient of the one who, having experienced the superiority of your arms, still hopes to overcome you by strategy. Peace, whenever it shall be established on fair and honorable terms, is an event in which both nations ought to rejoice. But in the meantime, every motive that can operate on men who love their country and are determined not to lose it calls upon us for increased vigilance and exertion." This proclamation again arouses the ire of the legislature, whose members are by now convinced that peace is actually concluded. Still angered at their forcible exclusion from their chamber, they adopt a resolution of thanks to all the officers of Jackson's staff, except the General-in-Chief himself. Now, the French that had volunteered to fight with the American forces are no longer needed, and Jackson issues a general order commanding all French subjects to retire within 3 days to a distance from New Orleans not nearer than Baton Rouge. On March 3rd, there appears in the Louisiana Courier an article bitterly critical of Jackson's order expelling the French. The article in question is written by Louis Louyeli, a Frenchman who has become a naturalized American citizen and who is a member of the Louisiana legislature. The article reads in portion, "The President alone has, by law, the right to adopt against alien enemies such measures as a state of war may render necessary. We do not know any law authorizing General Jackson to apply to alien friends, a measure which the President himself has only the right to adopt against alien enemies." Jackson immediately orders Louyeli arrested. imposing the penalty of death on all persons not citizens of or owing allegiance to the United States of America who shall be found lurking as spies in or about the fortification or encampments of the United States. A lawyer witnesses the arrest and rushes over to be retained. This lawyer presents a petition for habeas corpus to the United States District Judge Dominic Augustine Hall, who, on condition that the lawyer would advise General Jackson with regard to the matter before having formal service effected upon him, endorses the petition in his own hand. On receipt of this communication, Jackson flies into a violent rage against Judge Hall and immediately orders Colonel Matthew Arbuckle to have the judge arrested, citing mutiny as the reason. Judge Hall is arrested on the 5th of March and confined in the guardhouse. John Dick, the United States Attorney for the District of Louisiana, applies to the Louisiana State District Judge for a writ of habeas corpus for release of Judge Hall, and the writ is issued. Jackson learns of this and orders the arrest of District Attorney Dick, who is thereupon confined with Hall and Lou Yelly in the guardhouse at the barracks. On March 9th, when Lou Yelly does see court, he pleads that the military court has no jurisdiction to try him, and the court largely agrees and he's acquitted. Jackson refuses to accept the verdict of the court and issues a general order justifying martial law as warranting the temporary suspension of civil liberties and processes for their permanent preservation. Lou Yelly remains a prisoner. The chaotic event finally comes to an end on Monday, March 13th, when a courier arrives from Washington with the long-awaited official news of the ratification of the Treaty of Ghent. Jackson is instructed by the president to pardon all military offenders, and Judge Hall resumes his place on the bench. Jackson himself has to answer for the actions that he took in a contempt of court hearing. And mostly I tell the story to get to this part because we can hear from Jackson as he pleads his case in court. A disciplined and powerful army was on our coast, commanded by officers of tried valor and consummate skill. Their fleet had already destroyed the feeble defense on which alone we could rely to prevent their landing on our shores. Their point of attack was uncertain. 100 miles were to be guarded by a force not sufficient in number for one. Treason lurked among us and only waited the moment of expected defeat to show itself openly. The physical force of every individual, his moral faculties, his property, and the energy of his example were to be called into instant action. No delay, no hesitation, no inquiry about right or all was lost, and everything dear to man, his country, its constitution and laws were swept away by the avowed principles, the open practice of the enemy with whom we had to contend. In this crisis, and under a firm persuasion that none of those objects could be affected by the exercise of the ordinary powers confided to him, under a solemn conviction that the country committed to his care could be saved by that measure only from utter ruin, under a religious belief that he was performing the most important and sacred duty, the respondent proclaimed martial law. In the end, a judge, with a name that may sound familiar, Judge Hall, finds General Jackson guilty of contempt and sentences him forthwith to pay a fine of $1,000 to the United States. The reputation of Andrew Jackson largely survives this, though, as we'll continue to mention him in terms of other campaigns, and his fiery spirit continues to be one of his most notable traits. There's an exciting first on January 6th when John Stevens prevails on the New Jersey legislature to pass an act to erect a railroad from the River Delaware near Trenton to the River Raritan at or near New Brunswick. This is the first American railroad charter. However, Stevens is not able to raise funds for the project, and this specific railroad is never built. Over in Washington, D.C., 3 commissioners appointed during the Hartford Convention arrived to negotiate for the terms that have been agreed upon. News of Andrew Jackson's overwhelming victory at the Battle of New Orleans and, more importantly, the signing of the Treaty of Ghent precede them, and the public ends up looking unfavorably at the Federalist movement now, more than ever, as they're seen as subversive and an enemy to the national unity, and the party largely ceases to function on any meaningful national level. This ties into the years and years of Democratic-Republican supremacy that we're about to go through, known as the Era of Good Feelings. February also brings with it what will prove to be the very last battle of the War of 1812, at least the last on land, when British forces capture Fort Boyer near Mobile, Alabama, but halt their advance 2 days later when informed of the Treaty of Ghent and return the fort to American control. The Senate soon ratifies the Treaty of Ghent from last year, and just a few days later, on the 8th of February, President James Madison makes a special message to Congress regarding the end of the war. Now, because of the destruction in D.C., Congress is actually assembled right now inside Blodgett's Hotel, and before the year's out, will relocate again to the old brick Capitol. But at any rate, let's go to that meeting now. To the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States, I lay before Congress copies of the Treaty of Peace and Amity between the United States and His Britannic Majesty, which was signed by the commissioners of both parties at Ghent on the 24th of December 1814, and the ratifications of which have been duly exchanged. While performing this act, I congratulate you and our constituents upon an event which is highly honorable to the nation, and terminates, with peculiar felicity, a campaign signalized by the most brilliant successes. The late war, although reluctantly declared by Congress, had become a necessary resort to assert the rights and independence of the nation. It has been waged with a success which is the natural result of the wisdom of the legislative councils, of the patriotism of the people, of the public spirit of the militia, and of the valor of the military and naval forces of the country. Peace, at all times a blessing, is peculiarly welcome, therefore, at a period when the causes for war have ceased to operate, when the government has demonstrated the efficiency of its powers of defense, and when the nation can review its conduct without regret and without reproach. I recommend to your care and beneficence the gallant men whose achievements in every department of the military service, on the land and on the water, have so essentially contributed to the honor of the American name and to the restoration of peace. The feelings of conscious patriotism and worth will animate such men under every change of fortune and pursuit, but their country performs a duty to itself when it bestows those testimonials of approbation and applause which are at once the reward and the incentive to great actions. The reduction of the public expenditures to the demands of a peace establishment will doubtless engage the immediate attention of Congress. There are, however, important considerations which forbid a sudden and general revocation of the measures that have been produced by the war. Experience has taught us that neither the pacific dispositions of the American people nor the pacific character of their political institutions can altogether exempt them from that strife which appears beyond the ordinary lot of nations to be incident to the actual period of the world. And the same faithful monitor demonstrates that a certain degree of preparation for war is not only indispensable to avert disasters in the onset, but affords also the best security for the continuance of peace. The wisdom of Congress will, therefore, I am confident, provide for the maintenance of an adequate regular force, for the gradual advancement of the naval establishment, for improving all the means of harbor defense, for adding discipline to the distinguished bravery of the militia, and for cultivating the military art in its essential branches under the liberal patronage of government. The resources of our country were at all times competent to the attainment of every national object, but they will now be enriched and invigorated by the activity which peace will introduce into all the scenes of domestic enterprise and labor. The provision that has been made for the public creditors during the present session of Congress must have a decisive effect in the establishment of the public credit both at home and abroad. The reviving interests of commerce will claim the legislative attention at the earliest opportunity, and such regulations will, I trust, be seasonably devised as shall secure to the United States their just proportion of the navigation of the world. The most liberal policy toward other nations, if met by corresponding dispositions, will in this respect be found the most beneficial policy toward ourselves. But there is no subject that can enter with greater force and merit into the deliberations of Congress than a consideration of the means to preserve and promote the manufactures which have sprung into existence and attained an unparalleled maturity throughout the United States during the period of the European wars. This source of national independence and wealth I anxiously recommend, therefore, to the prompt and constant guardianship of Congress. The termination of the legislative sessions will soon separate you, fellow citizens, from each other, and restore you to your constituents. I pray you to bear with you the expressions of my sanguine hope that the peace which has been just declared will not only be the foundation of the most friendly intercourse between the United States and Great Britain, but that it will also be productive of happiness and harmony in every section of our beloved country. The influence of your precepts and example must be everywhere powerful, and while we accord in grateful acknowledgments for the protection which Providence has bestowed upon us, let us never cease to inculcate obedience to the laws and fidelity to the Union as constituting the palladium of the national independence and prosperity. Now, news of peace takes even longer to arrive for ships that are already at sea. And on February 20th, there's a naval encounter involving the famed USS Constitution. This next section is adapted from the USS Constitution Museum's dramatic description of the battle. Constitution is near the island of Madeira off Portugal. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the masthead lookout spies a large ship sailing to the southwest, and a half hour later, another ship is spotted further westward. The two ships turn out to be the HMS Levant, a 21-gun sloop of war commanded by Captain the Honorable George Douglas, and HMS Cayenne, a 22-gun frigate commanded by Captain Gordon Falcon. By 5 p.m., the ships have closed the distance, and Stuart orders 2 guns fired to try the range. The shot falls short, so about 6 p.m., the British short their sail and form a line, with Levant leading. All the ships hoist their ensigns, and the battle commences. Constitution has the windward advantage of greater maneuverability and the ability to block the wind from her opponent's sails. This also means that clouds of gunsmoke will envelop the British warships, obscuring their view of the American vessel. Stuart orders his crew to fire, and both British ships return fire, and a 15-minute exchange between the 3 vessels ensues. Once the smoke clears, the Constitution is alongside the Levant and fires a broadside. Then, with the Cayenne maneuvering to attack one of Constitution's weak spots, Stuart orders the main and mizzen topsails braced aback, causing the ship to back sternward, under the cover of the gun smoke, and surprising Cayenne. The battle continues for another 30 minutes, and after more sailing and more blistering fire from the Constitution's larger guns, Cayenne surrenders just before 7 p.m. An hour later, Constitution gives chase to Levant and exchanges broadsides, and the Americans rake Levant's stern, thereby prompting Captain Douglas to flee. Constitution pursues, firing with the bow chasers, cutting up the British warship's rigging and masts, and by 10 o'clock, finding that they cannot escape, Levant surrenders. Despite the 2-to-1 advantage of the British, it's hardly a fair fight. Constitution's heavier guns and heavy construction are able to both deal out but also absorb more punishment than her opponents. Still, it's a hard-fought battle with brilliant ship handling, and both the U.S. Navy and the American press are quick to sing the praises of the ship and crew. What also makes this battle significant is that the engagement with the HMS Cayenne and the HMS Levant is the last time that the Constitution, or Old Ironsides, engages in active combat during her long career. As we've mentioned, she's still afloat, making her the oldest commissioned warship still afloat in the world. Now, if by now the Americans' perception of the British is not soured enough, one event that takes place well and truly after the end of all fighting cements the public's perception of the British as dishonorable. Without a plan for their return, some Americans remain interred at Dartmoor through spring, and on April 6th, a number of American prisoners gather outside the limits of their prison courtyard, and inexperienced British guards begin firing. By the time the smoke clears, 7 prisoners are laying dead and another 31 wounded. Britain's Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs offers regrets and compensation to the victims' families, but the last prisoners still won't be released until early next year. On the morning of September 23rd, a powerful hurricane directly strikes the coast of southern New England, adding all its strength to a nor'easter, which has been affecting the region for the entirety of the preceding night. A southeasterly wind with gusts of up to 156 miles per hour, and I'm sure that that's an estimate because there was no equipment to accurately measure that at the time, swells the waters of the Narragansett Bay to an unprecedented height. The storm surge carries ships, destroys houses, and floods the area. By noon, the weather has abated, although it has damaged communities all along the coast of southern New England. The greatest of the destruction is concentrated in Providence. The Weybosset Bridge is completely washed away, and some 500 structures are shattered, with approximately a quarter of the city's taxable value lost. Now, despite the damage, there are only 2 fatalities, and both at India Port, the area both hardest hit and, until now, the most prosperous. Now, finally, on Christmas Day, December 25th, the Handel and Hayden Society gives its first performance at the King's Chapel in Boston. The society will go on to become the oldest continuously performing arts organization in the United States and is instrumental, no pun intended, in many official events to come. That pretty much does it for 1815. A little bit of a lighter year as it kind of ties up the loose ends from the War of 1812, and as the country is rebuilding, not too much else is going on for the moment. Next year, however, is an election year, so we'll be getting to cover that, the final address of James Madison, and we'll be looking into a book that sparks some decent levels of controversy in the day. But that's all I've got for 1815, so thanks for coming along with this journey through American history. Of course, we'll be continuing through all 250 years of our nation's story. Get in contact and tell me what you're enjoying about the show, and if you are enjoying the show, take just a moment and share the show with somebody that you know. It really does mean a difference as I'm trying to get the word out and get as many people as possible to get to hear our American history. Until next time, this has been our story, 250 years of the United States of America, and as always, thanks for listening.